G'day and welcome to another video with BetterPix. Today we're going to be talking about set to frame size and scale to frame size. And where this is applicable for the majority of your workflows will be when you have assets that are a different resolution to the timeline that you're working with. Now if we have a look at the timeline that I have today, you can see just by the name of the timeline and the settings, it's a 1920 by 1080 p timeline, which is full HD. It's in 16:9 ratio, and it's 25 frames per second. Pretty standard sort of timeline, and nothing too special there. What we're going to do is import 3 images. Now this example is applicable to both footage and still images. For today's example, I'm just using some stills that are a different resolution, but exactly the same process applies to any video files that you may be using. All right, let's head over and grab our 3 stills. We're just going to click and drag those directly into Premiere and drop them in the project tab there. You can see that they have moved in. There we go. And I'm going to click, select and drag the 3 of those images onto my timeline. And let's just zoom in a little bit more so we can see we have the 3 images there. Excellent. And immediately you can see that the images, the way that they're framed within that preview on the timeline, they're obviously much bigger than the timeline. Now these images are at a much higher resolution than the current timeline that I'm using, which as I mentioned earlier is 1920 by 1080. All right, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to reduce the size of that preview down to 10%. What that's going to allow us to do is to actually see the size of the image relative to the size of the timeline or sequence settings. All right, so if I just click on that image there and I click on motion under effects controls, you can see effects controls just there. Now, if you can't see effects controls on your desktop anywhere, if you just head up to window and make sure that effects controls is ticked, you will see it there. All right, so if we click on that file and click on motion, you can see there's this outline that's outside the size of the preview. That's the actual resolution or the actual size of the image that we can see on the timeline there. And as we can see, it's much, much bigger than the sequence settings that we have for this project. If I just click on that next image, there we go. Another way that we can look at the overall size of that still image is to just double click and you can see that that appears as well. All right, and we're just going to move on to that third one. Again, double click and you can see this one's a little bit bigger. Now, all 3 images are different resolutions, not by a lot, but just enough for them to be used for demonstration purposes. If we just head over to Bridge and we have a look at the 3 images here, you can see that the city skyline image is on the longest edge or the longest side, 4,000 pixels. The mountain image is 5,616 and the surfing image is 5,004. So 3 different resolutions and perfect for demonstrating what we're going to be talking about today. On the surface, the outcome is exactly the same. What's achieved is the image fits the frame to the video timeline much better, and there's none of the image that's cropped out. However, the way that it works is vastly different, and it really is a bit of a consideration to look at why it's important to consider scale to frame size versus set to frame size. If we start with scale to frame size, we can see now that the image is fitting into the frame much better. Now, it has reduced it to a point where there is no cropping on top and bottom, but we can easily just increase that size a little bit and it fits into that timeline perfectly. Now, if, say, for example, through the editing process of our project, we want to take it back to roughly the size that it was to begin with, what we're going to do is move that up and rescale that image. However, as you can see, the quality has dropped significantly. And that's because when you scale the frame size, you're actually removing pixels or removing data out of the image file and reducing it in size to fit onto that timeline. And that's a really important consideration, because if through the process of editing you decide, well, actually I want to crop in a little bit on that image, you've already lost that resolution and you obviously can't get it back. So that's the equivalent, I guess, in a roundabout way of rasterizing an image within Photoshop. For example, if you have a vector style image in Photoshop, you can increase and decrease the size of the image with no quality loss. Whereas once you rasterize that image, you commit it to the number of pixels that you're rasterizing it to. And increasing that image is going to result in some level of loss of quality. It's exactly the same with using scale to frame size in Premiere Pro. It's also important to note that if you have a look up in the motion area, the scale is set to 100%. So now that image is at 100% for a 1920 by 1080 timeline. So that's proof that the image has actually been reduced in size as a resolution to fit the timeline resolution. And the only way to do that when you have an image that's bigger than the timeline resolution is to remove pixels or to remove data. All right. Let's go back a step and let's go back to our original size image. What we're going to do now is right click on that image and we're going to go set to frame size. So you can see that if we look at it on the surface, the image is fitting the 1920 by 1080 timeline resolution. But if we have a look over in motion at the scale section, you can see that it's down to 40.5. And what it's done is it's maintained the original resolution of the image, but it's reduced it in size. Now, I know this could be a little bit confusing, but you can see that those control points of the image, as I mentioned, match the 1920 by 1080. But if we increase the size of that image, you can see that the scale is heading towards 100, which is what the original image was. Now, if we go all the way back up to 100, you can actually click and type 100. You can see that there is no loss in quality. And the image has maintained all of that wonderful original resolution, the high resolution that the image has given us, and the quality of the image is unaffected. Now, this is really important if down the track, as I mentioned earlier, that if you change your mind on how you want to edit this image and you want to increase or crop in on it or do anything that would require that extra resolution to be there, it's really important that that resolution is maintained. So that's where set to frame size has a major advantage over scale to frame size because that resolution is still there. It's a non-destructive way of editing and ultimately gives you that flexibility. Now, if you have multiple assets, what you can do is select all of those assets, which you can see I'm doing here, right-click and set to frame size. And that means that all of those assets have been aligned with the size of the timeline that you're working with, but without losing any resolution. And if we have a look at the motion up here, as that image is selected, you can see this one has been reduced to 28.8%. The surfing image has been reduced to 32.4%, and the skyline image has been reduced to 40.5%. Once again, if you want to, you can increase the zoom effect on that image by clicking and dragging those control points. And you can see we can zoom in quite a way. We can move it around. And we're still well under the 100% scale of the resolution of that image sitting on this particular timeline. Now, if you're working on a very large project, now keeping in mind, as I mentioned earlier, you can select those files, right-click, and set to frame size, and they will all be set to their frame size to match the timeline resolution. Now, if you're working with a very large project and it's not practical to select and right-click and set to frame size every time you bring a new asset onto the timeline, you can actually set up your project to automatically do it for you on import of that particular asset. All right, if we go up to Edit, Preferences, and Media, a little bit past halfway there, and the default media scaling, you can have it automatically set to frame size. So that means every time you bring in any asset onto your timeline, it will automatically set it to frame size rather than having to do it manually. What I'm going to do is remove those images and I'm going to re-import them. Let's go back to our original assets, drag them into Premiere, and then drag them down onto our timeline. And we can see by default, they have been set to frame size, and that scale percentage indicates that it is set to frame size because it is showing the various percentages that these images have been pulled in size-wise to match the resolution of this particular timeline. Some really handy techniques there to make the process quick and easy for you. Again, really handy, particularly if you're working on a larger project that has many assets that may be of varying size and resolutions. Hope this video has been helpful. Thanks again for stopping by, and as always, any questions are most welcome in the comments below. Thanks very much, and have a great day.